Hello, my name is Raj Kapoor and I'm a cello instructor with the Hartt School. Today we will be looking at J.C. Bach's Concerto in C minor for cello and orchestra. Before we get started, I would make sure that you have the edition Salabert copy of the score. There's a few editions on IMSLP that are available. However, because the piece is originally for viola and orchestra, some of the notes you'll find on the IMSLP version may be different than the one you'll find in this edition, which is considered the standard. So make sure you get a copy of this, either a scan or buy it on sheetmusicplus.com. Secondly, based on this edition, there's no great place to turn the page. So before you start practicing it, or if you have already started practicing it, immediately find a way to make a copy of either the second or third page in such a way that you do not have to frantically turn the page at the end of measure 98 going into measure 99, because that is the middle of a phrase and it will be unacceptable to have a page turn at that point. Lastly, as you're working on this piece, it is a fast piece. However, the marking in this score, quarter note equals 126, is not quite accurate. If you were to put that tempo marking on the metronome, you would realize that this feels rather slow compared to some recordings that have been made. I believe they intended to write dotted quarter note equals 126, and this gives it a feel of being in 2, and also it moves along quicker. So let's start right from the beginning. Right in the beginning, you want to start off very bombastically. However, then you will notice that measure 5, that section is a lower dynamic, and also we lose our double stop, so our sound might be a little thinner there. Before going to measure 5, however, I want to make sure we still sustain that chord as long as possible. I'm talking about the chord on measure 4, forgive me, measure 4, I want to sustain that chord as long as possible. I'll show you. that I did not take a retake there. I would not do that there because there's no rest written there, and I want to make sure that note is held as long as possible so that we keep the intensity alive. However, a similar spot in measure 8, we do have to do a retake. Nonetheless, I would try to hold the long note on measure 8 as long as possible. I'll show you from right where I was. So you really want to keep the vibrato going on that note, so that there's as minimal of a break as possible before you go into the pickup to measure 9. Next, there's a difficult passage at measure 17 to measure 24, 25-ish. I would suggest a fingering that minimizes the amount of shifting you have to do. I'll slowly do the fingering I have. At measure 16 to 25, there's a passage that's rather difficult, and I would recommend having a fingering that minimizes the shifting you have to do. I'll demonstrate once slowly the fingering that I'm doing. This fingering is a little nicer than the one suggested in the part because our shift ends up being a little smaller between our thumb on the B flat and the G on the first finger. And I would recommend doing something like that, or in fact maybe going across all 4 strings, just so that you don't end up having huge shifts that make you slow the tempo down there for some reason. Secondly, you might have noticed I changed the bowing slightly at measure 19 all the way until we arrived at 26. The reason why is that beginning at 19, instead of feeling like we're in 2, we suddenly have a hemiola, or we feel that we are in 3 suddenly. Bum, 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 bum. So to highlight that, I wanted to get to the second beats on a down bow. To do that, I took a lift right at 19 between the first and second notes. And now I'd slur 2 notes to get back to a down bow. So that whole section is a sort of backwards bowing, but it lets you get to a down bow on the syncopated second beats, as well as the accents in measure 24 and 25. It also allows you to have a little lift before you get to the chords, and that's very stylistic. So I recommend a bowing like this. Next, I want to look at measures 26 to 34. The dynamics here, if taken literally, the music will sound a little odd. You might notice that there's a forte, a piano, a forte, a piano. Those dynamics are good, and I want to do loud and softer, measure to measure. However, I also want to acknowledge the fact that we have a sequence here, an ascending sequence on top of that. So I want to add a dynamic on top of the ones that are written there already, as in I want to put a crescendo from the beginning of measure 26 until we arrive at measure 32. Literally, I'm gonna start a little quieter at measure 26. And then by the time I get to measure 31, which is technically marked piano, I'm gonna actually play that a little louder, just so we get a general ascending dynamic shape. I'll show you this slowly, starting right at measure 26. I would recommend doing a crescendo like that, just so that we have some direction and shaping within this phrase. Also, the articulation as written in the part will help with the loud-soft qualities, as in the louds are all separate bows and the pianos are all slurred together. So you will get a loud-soft, a forte piano effect pretty much no matter what. So I would not worry about doing that too literally. Next, right at measure 34, which is marked senza tempo, we have a change in color. First of all, I would not take the senza tempo too literally, which means no tempo or out of tempo. However, I would interpret it to mean that you can be a little more free and you don't have to feel that you need to rush through this section. In fact, on top of that, I would make sure you are very legato, as the score says, but I would try to be dolce or very sweet at the spot in comparison to the music that's come before. I'll start at measure 32 and I'll show you what I mean. It's just a moment in the piece where we're not so rhythmic and so stubborn in our tempo. Not that you can change the rhythm, but feel free to relax here. Going on, there's a very important measure at measure 54. We have for one bar marked forte sostenuto. And this measure comes out of 20 bars or so of straight eighth notes. So it's very important to do the sostenuto, as in to sustain heavily for that bar. And I'll show you what I mean at measure 52. That way, that measure becomes something really special and intense. Also, the following bar, I decided to take an up bow again, just so that I was at the correct bowing for when I get back to the theme at measure 57. There's another place in this piece where the dynamics aren't so explicitly depicted in the score, and the place I'm looking is measure 94 to measure 104. If you look back at measure 86, we have a forte, and then at measure 90, we have a piano. But then we don't have another dynamic marking until we get to measure 104. And I don't believe that the whole section from 90 to 104 needs to be piano. I feel that there can be some shaping and that we can come out at certain points. And so I'm going to play for you what I believe might work, starting at measure 86. Literally what I did is at measure 94, I decided to come back up to a mezzo forte and just sing that line. It's slurred compared to the spiccato notes we've had beforehand, and I'd like to express that with a higher dynamic. Then at measure 98, because we're going a little lower in register, I don't want to get too quiet, but I do try to have somewhat of an echo effect and drop down to a mezzo piano or mezzo forte dynamic for that. One area I do come up again though is the little tag of two measures at 102 to 103. These measures somehow feel that they are extra in a way, and I want to bring them out. So I once again come back up to a mezzo forte for those last two measures before 104. Also, that sets us up for a nice surprise pianissimo spiccato when we get to measure 104. There's one last section I want to talk about dynamics at, and that is measure 112. This is within the pianissimo that we just arrived at 104. Here we have a crescendo marked up to a mezzo forte. However, I feel that this section we have to be careful not to get too loud. It still feels like a rather calm and light section in contrast to the huge fortissimo section that we know is coming up at 136. So I don't really want to give anything away. In fact, I'm thinking of only doing a crescendo to maybe a mezzo piano at most. And I'll show you what I mean. barely any crescendo at all. And I would recommend that just so that you don't give anything away and ruin the surprise that's going to come at 136. Now, getting into 136, we have an amazing sequence, an amazing passage starting from 128 all the way to the recap there. It is marked crescendo, and you should fully do that crescendo as much as possible. Also, you might notice we have a molto allargando marked at measure 135. What's not written, but what is implied due to this allargando, is that you can get away with pushing the tempo ever so slightly until that point, until measure 135, in order to build excitement that we can then pull back on right at 135 going into 136. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to set a measure 128. That allows us to really get as much excitement out of that moment as possible. Lastly, I did do a fingering that I would suggest, actually starting back at measure 124, I would put my third finger on the A string and on the C, one finger on the E flat on the D string, and I would go from that point forward until you get to measure 135. I would just use third and first finger. This will allow you to, well, first of all, focus on everything else that's going on. But second of all, it will help you keep a line throughout all of these moving notes that'll be really nice in leading us from point A to point B. The last section I want to talk about is measures 151 until measure 154, just the end of the excerpt. This section is a little odd in that if you were to play exactly what's on the page, you would end up sort of sounding encumbered, and you might end up slowing down. What I decided to do is on measure 152 and 153, I left out the bass notes in the chords that are each the first note of those measures. As in, on measure 152, I left out the C natural on the first chord, and on measure 153, I left out the E flat. And this allowed me to move through that line more fluidly. I'll show you what I mean. So I can really go from that forte to the end. And then lastly, the chord as written, if you were to just do the down up bow that's suggested, it's a little difficult, and it's hard to really sustain that bow and get a maximum sound. So what I tried to do is I split the last chord of that measure, and I played the first two notes on an up bow and then the top two notes on a down bow, as in I reiterated the E flat. I'll do this slowly, the last measure. Now in context. That way you get all the notes that are written and you get a grand finish just to end the excerpt. I hope that was helpful. Good luck with your practicing. Thank you.